Well, I'm going to stand over here because I've spent minutes and minutes preparing a speech, at least 10, and I've jotted down some notes which I can't actually read. So if I stop talking, you'll know why, and we'll quickly throw to questions. Now, I was asked this morning if I would need a PowerPoint presentation, and I couldn't do a PowerPoint presentation at gunpoint, I'm afraid, so I'm just going to talk. But I suppose my theme today is, and this relates to my initial surprise of being asked to address an Engineers Without Borders conference, is that that's not my recollection of university in the 70s, when engineers were not what you'd call overly concerned about stuff. So obviously there has been a sea change. Now, I went to the University of New South Wales, which was an engineering university which tolerated these arts wankers like me. In 1980, when I stood for the student newspaper to begin my stellar career in journalism, in the vagaries of student politics, the arts students on my team had to ally with the Maoists, and some engineering students allied with the Trotskyites to form an engineering Trotskyite team. I have no idea why that was student politics. Anyway, our policy was more student theatre, but we had to also have a Solidarity Awareness Week with Eritrea to please the Maoists. The engineering students were pushing for the Film Society to show porn movies at lunchtime. But had they been elected, they would have also had to have a solidarity with the German Democratic Republic Week. Now, as it happened, we won, the engineering students lost, and in anger, they formed an organisation called SFEOBP, which was Students for Forgetting About Eritrea and Other Bullshit Places. SFEOBP SOC, and I think the president even got a parking sticker which says a lot about student politics in the late 70s. So anyway, it's very pleasing to see there has been a huge sea change in engineering students who now actually do care about the outside world and want to contribute in the ways that you'll hear about over the next 2 days. Unfortunately, a lot of aid tends to be designed and carried out by gormless former art students like myself who are disorganised and spatially challenged. I have a 6-year-old son who has to help me with Lego. I can do the 2 to 4 years, but beyond that I'm lost. So anyway, an example of this, very close to home, is in Dili, where after Dili was liberated, the New South Wales government thought they would send public buses to Dili, excess public buses that we don't need in New South Wales anymore, but no one actually thought to measure the streets in Dili. So they shipped over all these buses, and on the first day they discovered they don't actually fit on the roads and can't turn around. So about 20 of these buses, shipped at huge expense, were parked in a wasteland where they became squatter housing. Now, this is probably the most expensive way you could think of to send substandard housing to a developing country, but that's very much the picture of modern aid. Now, I think as a journalist, all journalists are members of the Something Must Be Done Club. We see these terrible places and we think something must be done, and we do stories saying something must be done. We have no idea what, and would be totally incapable of doing anything. But obviously things do have to be done. I've just got no idea what. And I think one of the things that really strikes me when I travel the world and see these desperate situations and think something must be done is also seeing how hard it is to actually help people. You think it's quite easy, you've got a skill or money or something, you can go and do something, but so much of it is like Dili, where you have a great idea for a project and it's totally pointless and useless, and a lot of money and time and effort that could go into doing something productive turns out to be a complete sham and does more harm than good. I think one of the first things you realise when you travel is that feel-good projects don't work. It's all very good to feel good yourself about doing something, but that has absolutely no bearing on whether it will actually do any good. I was recently in Ladakh in the Indian Himalaya, and there'd been a school group from an elite private school in Sydney, who I won't mention for fear of legal action, who sent a whole lot of students off to this very remote part of Ladakh to do an aid project. And they all thought about it and they thought, we can build a wall. Because, of course, what would people in these villages know about building walls? They've just been doing it for 2,500 years. So anyway, all these private school students went off and, to the great bemusement of the locals, spent a week building a wall, which the day after they left, having taken lots of photographs of themselves in front of the wall and writing articles for the school magazine, the villagers had to demolish the wall because, of course, it wasn't safe. Another time I was in Kosovo during the huge refugee crisis when NATO was bombing Serbia, and I was in a refugee camp, and Richard Gere came to express his solidarity with the refugees, and there was this tall, handsome man walking through the crowd surrounded by cameras, and someone asked who it was and was told it was a Hollywood film star, and he said, "Oh, that's a shame, I thought he was a doctor." So I think you do have to, bear in mind in any aid project that what you think might be good isn't necessarily what's going to be any good to anybody. People have very basic needs. People are, as smart as any other human beings are. They have their own skills. They don't necessarily need to have, this sort of missionary come in and show them what to do. It's much more prosaic and mundane as to working out what's actually going to be good for people. And I think this applies equally to big picture aid. When governments think we can give billions of dollars to a country and everything will be fine. When you look at Delhi, for example, you wonder where those billions of dollars have gone, because the roads are still crap, the streets still overrun, people still have no drinking water, there's only indifferent electricity supplies, and yet there's a shitload of white four-wheel drives there. And I think if you can get a contract to provide the UN with white four-wheel drives, you're made. And it's constantly depressing to see how much money is given by aid projects and how it does nothing but support this kind of expatriate infrastructure of people supposedly doing good, but you see absolutely no sign of it. Now, obviously being a bit unfair to many projects that do work, but I just want to make the point that it's so easy to go over there with good intentions and lots of money and do absolutely nothing. And often there is no good intention either. A lot of international aid is given as bribery. In the case of Afghanistan, it's given as bribery to organised crime. What I mean by that is that large sums of money are given for construction projects, politicians and officials skim it off, warlords get the construction contracts, they become very wealthy, it gives them the power to buy more guns and knock off their rivals, and how anyone could ever imagine that would do any good for a country is beyond me, but it happens all the time. When I was in Afghanistan, just after the Taliban had been ousted, I was up in Bamiyan, that area used to have the giant Buddhas that the Taliban blew up. And we were trying to film with American Special Forces who we knew were in the area. And this is a roundabout way of getting to a point, which I'll get to in a moment. But anyway, we found the Special Forces base by asking a 12-year-old boy in the village where the Special Forces base was. And he pointed out where the secret base was. And then we came up and the guard, who was about 16 years old, said, yeah, it's just down the road there, just behind, they're hiding behind the trees there. So we went down and we started filming the Special Forces from a distance. They saw us, we jumped in the car, went to drive off, but they got there first and dragged us out, guns to the head. Stood in a circle around us, pointing rifles, which I think, as anyone knows, is not the best way to actually open fire on anyone. But anyway, this is America's military elite, I stress. Demanded we give them our tapes. I said no, demanded the gunpoint, and I would have given the tapes, except that earlier that day I'd interviewed the local warlord, Mr. Halili, a very scary Islamic fundamentalist, terrorist, psychopath killer who was being sponsored by the United States, of course, as the anti-Taliban figure. And I mentioned that you can take my tape, but there's the interview with Mr. Halili at the start of it. So, by all means, but you might have to explain to Mr. Halili why his interview is not going to be shown. So I managed to negotiate that in return for erasing the footage of their base, we would be allowed to film one of their aid drops that night, which hadn't happened during the war because they're very secret squirrel and don't want to show their faces. I'm getting to the point very soon, bear with me. Anyway, so that night we go off to film them doing the aid drop, and while I was just casually talking to the soldiers as to what happens to all the aid coming down at great expense from the United States, thinking it would be going to the Red Cross or something, and they said that it's all going straight to Mr. Halili, the warlord. The reason they're doing that was they were trying to entrench Halili as the big man in the area, our son of a bitch, so they were giving him all the aid and he would then be in charge of distribution of it. That means that he could give it to his allies, he could make villagers agree to align with him, and he could then become the unelected, brutal, psychopathic dictator again. At the same time, there was another rival warlord who was trying to do the same trick, but Halili told the Americans that he was Al-Qaeda, and a B-52 appeared overhead, and there was no more rival warlord. So that's the kind of aid game that has been played in Afghanistan since 2001, and one of the reasons why Afghanistan is such a mess now. Another example of great aid projects in Afghanistan is a highway built from Kabul to Kandahar, cost of billions of dollars, most of which went to various warlords along the way. But because the road can't be secured, no one drives on it. So about $4 billion pissed away buying a whole lot of new Kalashnikovs for various criminal warlords. So so if I can just paint a cynical picture of government aid to begin with, it also, even when it's well-intentioned, like countries like Australia, a lot of aid is intended to support local industry. Therefore, Australian companies have to get the contracts to do it, which can be good, or it can put local companies out of business. I mean, everything that is done in aid has a political agenda to it, and it can have knock-on effects that can actually eliminate the point of what it's being done for. So to paint a gloomy picture, if I can just continue painting that gloomy picture, even when you get down to a grassroots level, you can find there are all sorts of problems with aid. One of the best aid projects since the 1970s has been the Grameen project of microfinancing, where instead of giving money to politicians or local governors, you lend it to women, unemployed women to use to start businesses, and we rely on the women to very carefully account for the money. And even though it's very small scale, it can have a terrific effect, except for the fact that in practice what's happened is that many women have been forced to collect money for their husbands, who then go and spend it and leave the women in debt. Also, it was being done by people giving loans on commissions, and there were many cases of women being threatened with violence unless they agreed to take out the loan. So it's a very complex thing trying to help people, and as often as not it tends to hurt people rather than help them. So I'm trying to paint a sort of gloomy, cynical picture at the start of a conference which is hopefully going to be inspiring and exciting, just to show that there are some really practical difficulties you have to work with, and ambitions, I think, have to be lowered as to what you're going to actually do. Grassroots projects are successful at the grassroots level. You can see the people you're helping. If you build a drain, you can see the people in the village who will have access to that drain. There will be people you'll be giving money to who can spend money on their families. There will be some local colleagues you can pass your skills on to. But it's all small scale, and that really is the point. You're not going to change the world. You will make a difference to a small number of people. And if enough of you do that, you will make a large difference to a lot of people. But forget about trying to save the world. It's not going to happen. Aid is a very targeted, difficult, small-scale, often thankless task that helps individuals rather than societies. It's the process of lots of people doing that and taking those hard steps that actually does make a difference in the bigger picture. But it actually needs people who know what they're doing, who are dedicated, who are cognizant of the human realities they're dealing with, who lower their ambitions to do the best job they can in a very small area. That is the only aid that is really successful, in my opinion, which is exactly the sort of thing that people like you can be doing. I did make other points, but I can't read my writing. Would anyone like to ask a question while I think of something else to say? Yes?
Could you give us an example of a successful aid project?
You got me there. Look, I have enormous... If I was going to give money to an aid project, I'd give it to MSF, because I see the fantastic work they do. These are doctors who, take 6 months off work at their own expense, go somewhere and run a hospital or something. And you can actually see every day they're doing good work. And, you have to admire their idealism, but then when you actually see MSF doctors, these sort of cool French guys, these hot French chicks, they're having a good time as well. But of course that is emergency aid, and even there is a downside, because every time you do a successful aid project, it does help the people. It also obviates the government of any responsibility to do that. And if you look in somewhere like the Democratic Republic of Congo, the entire health system is run by MSF. They'll go to a state hospital where people haven't been paid for months, where there's no medicines. They will pay the wages, they will provide the medicine and the skill, and that's great. I mean, people need that, but you also have to realise that long term it's not a solution. Ultimately, governments have to be held to account, and governments have to acknowledge their own responsibility. In Cambodia, for example, more than half of the GDP comes from donors. Now, if they weren't giving that money, people wouldn't be getting anything. On the other hand, it means that the government can blindly go along ripping off the country, evicting people from villages and building their big resorts and everything without actually looking after their own people. That's not, again, a long-term solution. It always amazes me that aid is not tied to governance, to actual, objectives and criteria that a government must fulfil in terms of its own responsibilities to get any outside assistance. But often as not, it's given for diplomatic reasons to cosy up to the government, to increase the influence of your country in that region, rather than to help the people. That's a semi-optimistic answer. Yeah.
Have you seen anywhere where trade has been a bonus to the community better than any of the aid projects?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think whether you call it fair trade or free trade or whatever, if it works, it is the best generator for wealth in communities. I believe strongly in globalisation, as long as you bear in mind the very serious downsides of that and the need to eliminate them. But yes, trade is essential. But the great problem is, as bad as the IMF is and the World Bank at times is and Western governments are, the biggest problem is national governments in developing countries, where they tend to be mafia states, and there's only so much that can be done in the absence of good government in a country. Yeah.
Thanks for your feedback. I guess it sort of matches up to people's general perception of journalists in Australia.
Cynical.
Not only cynical, but also take the easy pitch. And I wonder, in diminishing complexity, which journalists are very good at doing, whether they therefore sort of formulate an appetizing simplicity around aid, which is digestible, which the Australian public is really looking for. That cynicism sort of feeds into the idea that, aid doesn't work.
No, I don't mean to be saying that. I think there's a simplistic picture given about aid as well as, here is a starving child, give money, this starving child will be okay. It's a very complex issue. All I'm trying to say is that, I am constantly amazed by the problems I encounter and how enormous efforts that are being done to develop countries from outside seem to yield so few results. It really is, which makes me think much more that grassroots aid is the most effective, and that grassroots aid has to be approached in a very, cognizant manner of the practical difficulties at the ground level. Yeah.
Hi. Someone asked before whether you could give an example of a good project. Would you not say that there, with all good projects and bad projects, that it's varying degrees and there's different impacts in lots of different ways that people are affected by that project. So although you can't think of a personally good project in your opinion, but would you agree that there are projects that have had a positive impact?
Yeah. I can think of lots of good projects, but they were all very small-scale projects. Recently I did a project about snow leopard conservation in Ladakh, where it's involving hundreds of people in a few villages trying to change attitudes about not killing a snow leopard that comes into the village, and it's the practical effect of that is that a couple of snow leopards have been saved. It really does take enormous effort in a very focused area to bring about small changes. That's really what I'm saying. So that rather than thinking that you can, throw billions of dollars at a problem that'll disappear, I think targeted aid works most effectively at the micro level, with strong commitment and low expectations of just how much is going to be achieved, realistic expectations of how much is going to be achieved.
You mentioned that good governance in the developing countries is one of the most important factors. The Australian government and the armed forces have had a role to play in African Police Timor, amongst other countries, particularly in the Pacific. Could you comment on the effectiveness and the ups and downs of Australia's involvement on the governance side of countries in the Pacific?
Well, it's very hard to speak about what the ADF is doing because the Australian Defence Force is known for many generations that no matter who they're fighting, the real enemy is Australian journalists. We have no access whatsoever to the army except on a very organised occasional PR bullshit tour. If I work with the military, I work with the British military or the American military. I never work with the Australian military. I think they're a pack of bastards. I'd love to say they're doing good work, but I have no idea because I'm a journalist, so why would they tell me?
We've got you on air, great.
Yeah. I won't be here for that, it's a shame.
Questions to him, that'd be
Yeah. Up the back there.
Eric, would you say that disaster relief effort suffers the same problems as the overseas aid you're talking about?
Well, it does. I mean, I've covered some emergency situations where, it's been staggering how much has been done with so little effect. Again, sounding too cynical here, but I mean, it's inevitable. I remember once I went to an earthquake in Afghanistan where there was no fuel in Afghanistan. The helicopters had to fuel in a neighbouring country of Tajikistan. By the time they flew back and filled up and flew back again to the area, they were almost out of fuel and, could go in about a 50-kilometre radius where they had to go back again to get fuel. I mean, it's, the world is a challenging and difficult place. So I'm not saying there shouldn't be disaster relief, I'm saying it's absolutely essential there's disaster relief. But again, there's only so much that can be done, and if only more focus was done on preventing disasters, and having preparedness for disasters within the area rather than relying on the outside world to come and fix it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're saying that governance has to be the answer. It sounds like the progress you talk about at the start, the throwing billions of dollars to war, are they examples of where the aid actually has been targeted at governments?
No. There's a difference.
As well, are there any examples of where somehow aid, whether grassroots or targeted elsewhere, has actually led to the kind of governance?
Gee, that's a tough question. Look, there are varying degrees to which it's been done very badly. Afghanistan is an example, and Iraq is an example of how it's been. You couldn't design a more stupid way of doing it. Look, I'd love to think of some examples of where aid has been tied to effective changes in governance. It's tried in Papua New Guinea with varying results. It's tried in Cambodia very half-heartedly, particularly by Australia, which I think has an appalling record on human rights. Whenever I speak to NGOs in Southeast Asia, Australia is generally put on par with China for absolute disregard for human rights and the acts of bastardry regularly done to people, including recipients of Australian aid. So I think we're in a very bad situation compared to other nations. I'm very cynical about Australia, the Australian government, the Australian Foreign Affairs Department and the Australian Defence Force. It makes me a very unproud Australian. Yeah.
I'm interested, I guess, as a journalist you get to go to places and see things, but it's, often you've got a microphone or a camera between you. I know that you've had some very personal experiences. How do you decide when it's time to put it down and actually get involved in a situation? Whether it's, a situation with somebody who needs help or, something dangerous, etc., where you realise that the role of the journalist comes second to the role of, I guess, as humanitarian?
Generally when we've got enough footage. Which, sounds terrible, but that's what we're there for. I mean, obviously, if you come across a car accident or something, you don't get out and film it. You do what you can. There's been situations where we've had to give first aid or we've had to take injured people to hospital. But, most of the time, if I'm covering people trying to, build a levee against a flood or something, we're doing a story that will hopefully have far more effect on helping that situation than, becoming another body loading a sandbag. If I worked for commercial television, of course, I'd be loading the sandbag on camera, which I have also done. Anyway, up the back.
The military accept collateral damage.
They encourage it.
Okay. I grew up in a generation where we had a sort of motto: "Better light a candle than to curse the darkness." Are you not a professional curser of the darkness?
I would have liked to think I'm a professional candle lighter. But I also realise how hard it is to light a candle and how you can get burnt by it. I mean, I don't go around the world to try and discourage people from being interested or concerned about what's happening in other countries. I go around the world trying to do stories to show people what's happening, so they have some understanding of, you know, the reality, the need and the complexities. But we do have to do that in a 23.5-minute time slot, which is a lot for television but not very much for giving information. So yeah, I mean, we do have to, you know, simplify it and selectively, you know, report on aspects of a situation. We can't tell the whole story ever. Yeah.
G'day. Can you talk about media organisations in developing organisations and what you think they could do to improve the situation of their country?
Well, there are very brave journalists in developing countries who are frequently subjected to harassment, or in the case of Sri Lanka at the moment, execution. Russia has the highest rate of journalist murder. We saw in the Philippines the other day a massacre of journalists. I mean, it's much more difficult to operate in those areas than it is in a you know, democratic civil society. You know, I do think it's important that Australia do things like, you know, projects to train journalists in developing countries, but more effectively, the governments have to make an issue of journalists being killed. I'm at the moment at the ABC, we're trying to encourage the Australian government to indict and seek the deportation of Mullah Krekar, an Islamist leader in Norway who ran a terrorist group that actually killed my cameraman and almost killed me. He's admitted his involvement in it. He's living in Norway, and the Australian government thinks it's all too hard to try and, you know, arrest him. Yeah, I mean, I'm all for journalists being protected, obviously. And that's a sort of step that, that the Australian government should be taking, which it isn't. Yeah.
Just in relation to, we talk about the aid organisations, and often the aid is not really going fairly well on the ground. Do you think a lot of that has to do with the number of aid organisations that often turn up to a situation?
Often it's like a medieval camp where you see all the flags being planted and, you know, staking out the territory. If you know, in Aceh after the tsunami, it was you know, NGO heaven. It was great. And obviously there is a difficulty in coordination when you have so many different people running around trying to do their own thing. On the other hand, there is a lot to be said for small is beautiful. I mean, it's possibly better to have large numbers of small aid groups doing particular projects than one giant bureaucracy trying to do the whole thing. There's obviously a need for more coordination between NGOs, but I don't think having some sort of big Uber NGO is the way to go either. Yeah.
You made the generalisation before as sort of...
That's what I do.
Small aid projects good, sort of big aid projects bad. Could you make some sort of similar generalisation on sort of private aid projects and public government aid projects?
Well, they're all very different. I mean, you know, one of the problems with the United States government, particularly under the Bush nightmare, was the way that aid was being very much politicised. You know, there was a discouragement of contraception. You know, the governments. You know, one of the aspects of governments that they were demanding was projects discouraging contraception in return for getting aid. I mean, government aid can be extraordinarily politicised. It doesn't really matter whether it's government or private. The question is the outcome, and I don't really see any greater success of outcomes, depending on whether they're government or private. It just depends on how savvy they are and whether they know what they're doing. Yeah.
The efficiencies involved in having aid run by government would be higher than having aid run by small private projects. For example, if you're in, say, Congo, and the government had enough money to effectively run the health system, that would probably be more efficient if they were able to.
Well, the government does have enough money to run the health system. They're just not spending it on the health system. Why would they, when they can spend it on mansions in Paris? I mean, the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo is basically a mafia. It's a criminal organisation that does deals with other criminal organisations who are the paramilitary and rebel groups. It's the most post-apocalyptic environment you can imagine. There is no government as such. There are officials who demand bribes but don't provide services. The Congo is the worst example of a government neglecting its responsibilities and relying entirely.
I picked the wrong countries.
As for government efficiencies, I work for the ABC, I don't know about that. Yeah.
So you say that you go around the world reporting on these issues to raise awareness and help people know that these bad things are happening, but then you're saying that anything that people try to do for these bad things just doesn't.
No, I'm saying that at all. I mean, I do stories about successful projects, but what you should watch the program. It's bloody good. But what I find is that the ones that are the successful projects tend to be ones that involve a lot of time, a lot of effort in a very concentrated area. When you're trying to look at success stories on a bigger scale, you tend not to see them. But I try and do positive stories. People like positive stories. People like seeing solutions. We're always trying to have an uplifting element in a story about genocide or something. But that can be hard to know.
Recommendation. So I suppose the recommendation is there again, the small scale.
Yeah, but as I said at the start, I'm a useless, spatially challenged arts graduate type. I'm not the right person to be deciding what's going on. You are the right people to be deciding what's going on. It involves skills and practicalities and realism that I probably lack, but engineers are full of, hopefully. Yes?
Given your experience, what would you say to journalists in developing countries who are trying to set up their own, leading on from the question earlier about media in developing countries, do you think it's important to encourage that in terms of a development aspect?
Absolutely. I mean, civil society is utterly essential to good governance. You don't have good governance without civil society. You often have bad governance with civil society, but you haven't got a hope unless you have a free press, rule of law, independent judiciary. If you haven't got those three things, you're on a hiding to nothing. Yeah?
So good governance is really important in your point of view. What do you see as the role of democracy? Is that the solution?
Well, genuine democracy, but they're few and far between. I mean, Russia's a democracy. Cambodia, another sterling example of democracy. India, going great guns. In some ways, China is more accountable to its people because they're actually terrified of being overthrown in a revolution. They've got no fear of being voted out of office, but they're not as relaxed and comfortable as some other regimes that have a quasi-democratic system they've sewn up. Governments need to think they can be chucked out by the electorate or by bomb-throwing revolutionaries if they're going to concentrate on doing a job for the people. Yeah.
Just following on the journalism questions, Mark Scott recently painted a very broad picture on what he'd like the ABC to become, basically dividing BBC World and CNN.
Yeah.
And painted it as a way to help change countries like Fiji and Burma by broadcasting into the country and changing people's minds. What do you think of that, Graham?
Well, Mark Scott's not a dummy. I don't think what he meant was the way he's been interpreted as saying that the ABC should somehow be pushing Australian foreign policy or something. I think what he was trying to say is that an example of an independent broadcaster that doesn't follow the government line and actually criticises people is a great example to a society of what is a very important and positive quality of Australia, which is our freedom of media and our civil society. That's not an argument that it's going to persuade the Chinese government to allow Australian network to be shown in China. I think, I'm not sure I agree the ABC should be an international broadcaster. We can barely afford to do our domestic broadcasting. Obviously worried that programs like mine will lose their budgets to pay for 24-hour news services. But
I think he did ask for an increase in budget to match it.
Yeah, never quite happens that way though. You get a little bit and then they have to make up the rest from programs like mine. But I don't run the ABC. Yeah?
Just one challenge that I have today is just always balancing hope and enthusiasm with frustration, skepticism, and I'm guessing you're in the cold face of these kind of things as you travel around the world. How do you manage that on a personal level and don't kind of fall into the traps that happen to like a colleague or ex-colleague, like a lawyer?
Can't comment on that directly. Look, I mean, I may sound very simple. Actually, I mean, the reason I keep doing this is because I am constantly inspired by what I see. And, even though most governments are appalling, most people are great. Most communities are fantastic. And, whenever communities are empowered, it's always a much better result. It's, when the demagogues and the crooks take over, which is most of the time that there are problems. So, I mean, I'm constantly inspired by ordinary people and how change can happen. As long as it's, targeted towards ordinary people and uses ordinary people and doesn't get too ambitious. Yeah.
You were saying how you as a journalist is a member of the Something Must Be Done.
The Something Must Be Done Club.
I imagine that a lot of us eventually are the members of the We Can Make Something to Do club. And,
Well, you're also, you know how to do stuff club.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you could comment on if you see ways that we could work with the Something Must Be Done club better, or if there's sort of channels that aren't getting used.
Well, I think actually doing a project is always going to be good. Not necessarily a $5 billion highway from Campbell to Kandahar, but if you're on a village digging a well or something, or improving a road, it does have positive effect on the ground. I mean, I'm not in any way cynical about those sort of projects. I think that's exactly what does make a difference. But it does make a difference on a small scale, and it needs to be replicated all over the country to make a big difference. But I think the question of NGOs in general, I think NGOs do tend to play a positive role in pointing out problems to governments and in putting gentle pressure on governments to improve what they're doing. Even though you'll find donor countries like Australia will drop the ball on that, other countries will support them in that. I think particularly in Cambodia, the NGO lobby is quite an important lobby for restraining the excesses of Hun Sen. But NGOs can also be cowed, as they have in Sri Lanka, through the enormous pressure the government's put on them and the way the UN abrogated its responsibility. Yeah.
So you sort of feel that you're inspired by the fact that you do see lots of ordinary people and a lot of ordinary communities doing good things. Yet the problem is that you've got a few crazy psychopaths in power.
Oh, it's more than a few.
Yeah. But overall, I mean, you'd think there'd be a lot more people in the world who care more about making the world a better place than the few that are just doing it for their own.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, those few had the most power. That's the problem.
Yeah. So, how does that power come about? Is it because the crazy people actually just want whatever it is they want so much harder than anyone else, and everyone else is just trying to be happy doing their own thing?
Well, power comes to the point of a gun. I mean, they have the guns. It's a very simple equation. But I mean, it's some countries do improve over time, and countries that develop an infrastructure, that develop an educated population, that are exposed to outside ideas, have a much better chance of gradually improving the situation than closed countries that are disaster areas.
I'll just add a comment to that.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of ways it's got to do with the fact that all those people who do care are spending all their time doing something useful. And when it comes about with politics and people above us that are making those decisions and making our life hard, it's really hard to influence them. And when you are working so hard to try and get something done on such a small scale, everything else is unimportant, because you do what you can with what you've got from the people who have the decisions and have that power. And I could care less about what they do at the top, because whatever they decide at the top is just going to change how I do things because of what's available to me. I just do what I can and keep moving. The little things that happen along the way that, people's lives that change, that's what makes it worth it.
Exactly. How are we doing for time?
Last question. Sorry.
Okay. Yep.
Just one, I guess, a different tack on the role of media as development practitioners. Often you might be in a remote area and there might be nothing, no services, but people have got a radio and TV. And I had a short trip to the Philippines, and there was a media company there, and a big part of their corporate social responsibility is being education programs into the teachers who might have 40 or 50 children in that class, and no chance for themselves to better their professional development, or for the children, promoting educational programs within the community. Have you seen any other good examples, or have you got any comments on the role of media and their corporate social responsibility, aside from purely reporting on?
I think technology communication technology is a wonderful thing for communities. I mean, you have a lot of villages in India now that don't have electricity or radio, but they use their mobile phones to get music and information. I mean, it's, if you go through China, you'll find extraordinarily connected society, even in remote villages. I think that is a great cause for encouragement, that people do have access to, social media or mass media on an increasing scale. But that, again, depends on a bit of infrastructure being, carried out in the regions. Okay.
Might just stop there. I noticed that we're getting to 10 past. We're running away. Questions? I don't have any more questions. I just want to say thank you again for coming out. I think a few things came to me. One of them was you spoke a lot about the small, and what's great is the Legend is Our Borders has that embedded in its philosophy, the idea of grassroots, on-the-ground development, always with a local partner, always looking at the effect of our projects and our activities on the lives of real people, as opposed to, big picture projects, the big aid projects of multi-million dollars that often don't get there. I had an interesting lecture. I think what it sounds like you're saying, I had an interesting lecture once from a business in management, and he said the answer to everything is it depends. And which made the exam incredibly easy, by the way. But it sounds like that's really what you're saying. When you're looking for the specific situation, you're looking for the specific opportunity to create change, right? And it just depends. You have to be local. You have to understand the situation in order to know what's right. The other part is maybe the guy who, when you saw Richard Gere, said, "I wish that was a doctor." Maybe next time, if we get out there and keep on doing our work, you might say doctor or an engineer. That'd be cool too. Could I have everyone just thank Eric Campbell again?